Good afternoon again, everyone. I'm Larry Paska, Executive Director of the National Council for the Social Studies, and this was the second time in 2 days that I've heard the challenge of social studies versus social sciences. Yesterday, one of our board members had just come back from China and was kind of informed about that we are really one of the few places on earth that calls it social studies. So now I'm heeding that kind of challenge and wondering, whether those semantics really could be very important for us. The focus of my presentation, if we were to do a SWOT analysis, is really more on the T to start and then the O. I want to challenge us with a few opportunities and possibilities because we've heard the phrase C3 framework raised a lot this morning. So I want to revisit that framework and offer that as a possible conversation starter for the last hour for the day. The challenges that we face when we kind of take that macro view and go to the social studies as a whole are the same as what we've talked about within the individual disciplines. The struggle for standards, that often they don't translate into a really viable curriculum. They're wonderful documents, they're great resources, but how do they actually make a 40-minute period come alive? The curriculum itself, very often in all of the social studies, very heavy on content. The belief that if we could just somehow cut open a child's brain and dump every piece of factual information into it, sew it back up, and give a multiple choice test, they would have the knowledge they need to be successful in the world. And instruction often starts at a default where we know that if we start with knowledge and understanding, we'll get there. The problem is that we know it's analysis and inquiry that really not only inspires kids, frankly, it inspires educators. They want to come to work in the morning when they feel like they're going to be challenging kids and when they're engaging in inquiry. Assessments, if we assess the social studies, social science disciplines, we often do so at the high school level. I am from New York. My entire career until last month was in New York State as a teacher, administrator, as a state education policy specialist, just like Matt for social studies. And we had assessments at the elementary and middle level, which were removed because of funding. And so the challenge there is that we know we don't assess it enough, whatever it is. And at a state level, that becomes problematic because how do you assess hundreds of thousands of kids at once in a discipline? So oftentimes, again, we may go back to questions of knowledge and understanding over inquiry. The prioritization of time. ELA and math have been prioritized. We know this. However, we have really good evidence now that time's really been compromised at the elementary level and also in schools that might be identified as high needs, where we may see the instructional time given to the social studies marginalized even further. I offer this last bullet because we can't underscore enough the importance of professional development. Is it systemic? Is it supported? And this is a survey that we do of our own members every year, and so this is 2015 data that just kind of tells us they could rank different priorities of what they saw as the greatest challenges in the social studies. Limited funding and decreasing budgets comes up very highly, even though we've largely pulled ourselves, we think, out of the recession. A lot of school district budgets still are struggling to keep up, and oftentimes social studies programming gets kind of limited. A shift in focus to standardized testing, as we know, larger class sizes. I really want to draw attention to this last challenge, though, because this, again, speaks to the larger issue. And again, I offer this perhaps as a threat, but also as an opportunity, that our colleagues in schools are saying we just don't have time to collaborate together. So any collaborations we do as organizations or any collaborations that happen across the social studies have to take into account the fact that teachers won't have the time necessarily to benefit from that sitting together. So teachers who are collaborating in teams, who have dedicated team time, who have things like professional learning communities in a school, that time isn't always there for them. And so that's a piece of data that we take rather seriously. So I guess all these challenges just mean, are we relevant, right? And that's been the focus of our work this morning. A decrease of instructional time. I also add this extra caveat that we see a decrease in leadership across the social studies as a potential problem. So previously I was a district director of social studies for a medium-sized school district in New York. That was a luxury position. Most districts with 3,500 kids do not have someone whose sole focus all day is just to focus on social studies. And even then, I focused largely on teacher observation. I didn't get a chance to do professional development as extensively as we all would have liked to. But that lack of leadership translates into so many other areas. It does translate to a lack of leadership in professional organizations. So finding teachers, administrators, scholars of the social studies who want to come together and actually be an advocate and a leader in this profession, we struggle to find that pipeline and keep it very robust. The lack of a consistent vision for what social studies education looks like, not in high school, not in middle school, but K-12. When that youngster starts in kindergarten and they go to graduate, have we really thought through what a formalized program looks like year after year so that we know exactly what it means to develop geographic literacy or economic literacy or sociological literacy year after year? Again, those leaders' positions are not there in our schools, so it's often difficult to have that articulated. Of course, our biggest worry, we don't need social studies, we've got social media. And in fact, we've engaged civically. I would argue that this presidential election season and our local and state elections, if you're on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, there have been so many comments, I can't keep up with them. We have civic engagement, congratulations. We've posted comments, we've done our duty. And that, again, is the struggle we have as social studies educators, is we're competing for that perception that my posting a comment and perhaps going to the voting booth constitutes I've done social studies, and I'm done. So I'm going to stop there and say, let's focus on the opportunities. When the Common Core came out, folks like myself actually said, wow, this is really great. The entire country has recognized how important social studies is, because the Common Core is asking us to do the very things social studies educators do every day. We do text-based evidence. We look at sources and get competing perspectives using different pieces of information. We read informational texts all the time. So this is phenomenal to us. Most people actually didn't see that view. I don't know that that was a widely shared view, because I would often say that and people thought I was a little crazy. But the reality is that the instructional shifts of social studies this is what social studies has always been about. When we've surveyed students, so the same survey that we give to teachers, we give students about their social studies experience every year. The top 3 responses they give to us of what skills they gain from the social studies are forming an opinion, critical thinking and analysis, the ability to evaluate concepts and ideas. So the good news is our kids do leave social studies classrooms thinking that they get to have an opinion, that they get to inform it with perspectives, with sources. They believe that's the value of their social studies experience. So again, good news, our kids are thinking this. So we've talked a lot about C3 today, and just as a reminder of the C3 framework and how it came about a few years ago, again, the push to college and career readiness. So the National Council for the Social Studies, in partnership with many of you, saw the importance of civic life and understanding what it means to be a civically ready student, if you will, as a critical dimension. We also saw that putting together a national set of standards may not be the answer at this time. Instead, do we put together a framework that can be used to help other states develop their standards and develop their K-12 instructional programs? So the goal of this framework was just that, to give a guiding post for our states and our districts around the country to think through what social studies education looks like. So the C3 framework is built upon this notion of an inquiry arc. And what's really powerful about the inquiry arc to us, and again, thank you to all of you who are contributors to this notion, because I think there's so much power moving forward if we can kind of rethink how we work with this now together as associations. The idea is that all inquiry begins with defining a question. What is it I want to know about the world? If you go around and just listen to kids in the cafeteria or on the playground or on social media, what is it they're asking about in their given day? Chances are they're asking about social science-related issues. They're worried about how they get along. They're worried about their role in the world. They're worried about what they're doing where they are. Will they have enough money for college and growing up or for that first job? They're worried about our worries. So that's the good news. The next question is, so how do you frame an inquiry around that question? So the inquiry arc teaches us that we need to tap into the different disciplines, and here's the part that I'm going to challenge us all, because we've been talking a little bit over lunch about this idea, that in this second dimension of applying disciplinary tools, if I see myself as a history teacher and I teach history all day and I'm a history major, I've now taken this dimension and I've said, great, we're going to do a history inquiry. Many of us know, I don't know if there's such a thing as a historical inquiry, because I think a historical inquiry depends on other social science disciplines working in tandem to solve that problem. I can't solve a problem about how I increase my paycheck without figuring out things like, where am I living? What's the cost of living where I am? Who did I vote for, and what are some of the positions they took to support the health of my community? So the idea of Dimension 2 is, how do disciplines work together, and how do I select more than one discipline to solve this question, answer this question? The third dimension of our inquiry arc is what sources do I use and what evidence do I use to answer this question? And the fourth dimension is, so what's the conclusion I'm communicating? The answer to my question could be yes or no. And as teachers, we have to be willing to embrace the fact that real inquiry is not about the correct answer, it's about an answer informed by a perspective. And if I'm willing to accept that my student's answer is not necessarily my belief, but it is a belief informed by evidence, then I've done my job as a social science educator. So our framework, we at the National Council have put together a series of resources. We make the framework available. We have several bulletins that we've published since 2013. We've put sample inquiries and resources on our website. So again, I know this PowerPoint will be available to you. You can certainly access these resources. We've also been part of a C3 literacy collaborative through generous funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So we've partnered with the Center for Literacy Education to support a broader toolkit, how administrators, how policymakers, how scholars can use the C3 model for their own. The key to this work, though, has been the grassroots effort. So much like what Matt was describing with NGSS, this really became a teacher-led effort soon after its adoption, and that was the point. So I told you that I'm from New York. So New York State is one example where New York State actually created a toolkit with a sample series of inquiries built off of the C3 inquiry arc. But they kind of made it their own with some unique branding. And as a result, there's now a website called c3teachers.org where teachers across the country are blogging about C3. There's sharing sample inquiries. And this has become so organic that you now have states like North Carolina, Hawaii, Kentucky that have created their own hubs around inquiries for their own curriculum. The Library of Congress has just opened what's called an organizational hub. So they've created a hub of how you could use Library of Congress sources in structuring an inquiry. And the creators of this site call it the inquiry design model. Again, this isn't NCSS, this is an outgrowth of the work, but I think it's important to note because it may be a model for us to look at as we work together. The idea is we start with a compelling question, we figure out what tasks and sources kids need to use to answer that question. We send them on their way with really cool tasks that they're stimulating their thinking and supporting their own ideas. And they answer that question in the form of a summative argument. Not always a written essay, not always a document-based question essay, not a multiple choice question. We can choose the media that we want that response to be in. So I'm just going to gloss over this quickly. This is not a lesson plan or a unit plan, but it's what the inquiry model is built on. And the inquiry model itself, again, the question, the structure of supporting questions, the evidence that's used, and then what is the type of informed action kids could take as a result of that inquiry. So I'm going to rush through really fast. This is, again, a theory. Many of you may be familiar with Tim Shanahan's work on disciplinary literacy. It may be a guide for us to move forward. The idea that kids could learn in terms of how do you code switch between how a psychologist or sociologist thinks about the world and how do I use the way in which they access information to answer my question. So if I'm a geographer, I may need to use an anthropologist's skill set and an anthropologist's set of questions to answer my geographic question. And if we shift our curriculum model from one of let's teach the content and cut open the head and pour in the content so that child gets it, do we instead look at how is it that human beings of different professions really view the world? What are the questions they ask? How do they know their questions are even valid? How do they communicate and share the answers they're getting with each other? Because they don't work in silos. And so they have to be accountable, often publicly, for the answers that they're getting and that they're finding. So we know in social studies we can be very dominated by the big four subject areas. We know that that's a challenge for us. Again, I'm sorry I'm glossing through these, but again, you'll have these slides to look at later. I want to just draw attention to the fact that our definition of social studies as a council, this is a long-held definition, talks about the interconnectedness of these disciplines. They work together. They solve problems and they engage in inquiry together. So I shared this definition because I hope it's in the spirit of kind of our collaboration going forward, that as an organization, let's look at how the C3 inquiry arc might be a resource that all of us as associations could think through together and develop materials around. So I want to thank you, and obviously we'll talk a little bit more later. I hope I didn't ramble, but I really want to help us draw attention perhaps to the C3 inquiry arc as and the inquiry design model as a possible construct for us in working forward. Thank you.
Okay, so we have, why don't we take a few minutes for questions for Matt and Larry, and then there's a homework assignment for all of us, and then we'll go back to the open Q&A. Are there questions specifically for Matt or Larry?
Well, this is a tiny little question, but it may be bigger. How do you think your association would react to becoming the social sciences .org or what, I mean, and the teachers?
Yep.
How would the teachers react?
Very good question, very preliminary for us. I only raised that because the other day I was talking with one of our board members who had been abroad and had made that observation and said, you know, we really, if we want to truly be an international organization and embrace the members that we represent across the world, we should think about that. It started there. I can tell you that our board right now is very motivated on the idea of collaborating across the social sciences. So they've been very encouraging, and in the selection process where I came on board, we've talked very seriously about finding ways to work together. And so our strategic plan also will be reflecting collaboration as it's approved, hopefully later this month.
One quick follow-up anecdote and then an iconoclastic request. When we were fighting to get, I was in the Congress, and when we were fighting to make sure that social sciences were not excluded from NSF funding increases, Kay Bailey Hutchison in the Senate and her staff said, why do we need more money for social studies, in a disparaging way, implying that social studies was coloring in maps and drawing rivers on charts and memorizing capitals and stuff. So Susan's point, I think, is pretty relevant to sort of the public image. Second thing is, and this is really iconoclastic, I know you've done a ton of work on the C3 model, but I'd really urge you to explore getting rid of the first C. We are so college-centric in our society, and what you basically say to a whole lot of kids who aren't college-bound, either by ability, predilection, economics, or whatever, that you don't matter. That the reason we're teaching you these things is so you can go to college and succeed. There are just a lot of people who aren't going to go to college, and yet they need to be civic-minded and they need to be critical thinkers, etc. So I'm kind of big on not focusing our education system as if college were the be-all, end-all for everybody. That goes back to the point made by the first speaker, who I don't know if he's still on, but his point is we tend to try to assume that our goal is to make everybody like us. But there are a whole lot of people who aren't like us, and that's fine. We want to help prepare them as well.
It's Felice Levine. Thanks for the really good presentation about the framework. It would be helpful to know, given the principles of the framework, and actually what was a considerable effort to try to take those basic framework elements, which are so important, particularly in the K6 and 8 curricula, to look at the study of various scientific phenomena, which could include, but didn't, the social and behavioral phenomena. Can you imagine, I'll say, the next generation of our effort together with the work of Achieve and the science framework to incorporate social and behavioral phenomena into what is the general science curricula at K6?
I could see that as being a possibility. We'd have to sort of think about and talk about what, make sure that we have a similar definition of phenomenon. But I think that, like, sort of one of the places to think about is, how do we, in terms of the bandwidth, right? Like, how do we have contextual examples that get students to start thinking about things in different ways that aren't like, maybe not, it's not a full set of standards and curriculum, but, for example, right now, one of the things that I coordinated that's just getting started is a peer review panel that evaluates lessons and units and the degree to which they're designed for that next generation science standards. There's nothing that precludes a phenomenon from being, phenomena have a lot of different aspects to them. If your explanation of the phenomenon moves your understanding of the three dimensions of the standard, there's no reason to say that phenomenon couldn't have other aspects than sort of a pure science phenomenon necessarily. So I think that there's definitely some work there that could go around. Let's find teachers where they're at and what they need, which at this point a lot of them are interested in. What does it look like to really do this stuff in the classroom, and use some examples that fit with the social sciences background. I think that makes a ton of sense. I also want to mention that our standards in Kansas were very much based on the C3 framework, and our social science. I don't know how we could say that. We have a very long name actually for our standards that includes all those different names. But one piece that we've did there was even our assessments. The connections there, I'm sort of coming back to that idea of the connections across content areas. We built into our assessment that students have access to primary source materials and a writing prompt, and they read through those materials, have a writing prompt, have a chance to go back and do research within the system, and then their assessment is writing in response to that prompt, where they have to do exactly the sorts of things Larry talked about, where they have to make a claim about what's going on in this situation and back it up with evidence from those sources. And that assessment is that gives them a score for social studies and also for English language arts in the same system. So that's just an example of how these things connect up. If I had been at the State Department of Education longer, the next step was we're going to also have that same system develop items around sciences, so that it's like we're doing things that are synergistic and connect folks together. I would love to see, like I said, there's been this work around connecting math and ELA and science, and what's in the C3 framework actually overlaps a ton with that. I'd love to see that layered in on top of these intersections, and talk about what's in the middle where all of these things overlap that's really important for all students across content areas.
Before we go to the homework